All right, well, thank you all for joining today for the Disrespect for Marriage Act webinar, talking about how this particular federal bill will impact the church, will impact society, will impact religious liberty, and so many other areas. And we have some great panelists today that you'll be introduced to in a little moment. But before we get started, I just wanted to read some scripture and then pray as well. But I did want to mention before I did that throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll be tackling those questions, Lord willing, at the end of this webinar. Again, for those that are joining us, my name is Kurt Weaver, and I'm the director of the Church Ambassador Network with Pennsylvania Family Institute. Well, the passage that came to mind today as I was thinking about this webinar was Ephesians 5. And it's a little bit of a longer section, but I think you'll find this very interesting, especially with what is happening in our society today. Here's what it says, Ephesians 5. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. But sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among the saints. Let there be no filthiness or foolish talk or crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving. For you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure, or who is covetousness, that is an idolater, has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. And here's an important part. Therefore, do not become partakers with them. For at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. So walk as children of light. For the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true. And try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of the things that they do in secret. But when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. Certainly in that passage, there's a lot to unpack, and we're not going to unpack it all. But I think it's talking about us as believers, those who are joining on this call, pastors, church leaders. We are to be discerning in this world on what is right, what is good, what is righteous. And we're also called to walk as children of light, to walk as those who love. And to love is to care about righteousness. And even in this passage, it talks about we are called to expose the things that are in darkness. Well, there's many things being exposed today, and we're going to be talking about that in just a moment. So let's pray, and we'll continue on in our webinar. Father, we come to you now with humble hearts. Even as we celebrate this Christmas season, Lord, we know that you are the one who came into this world. You broke into this fallen, sinful world, and you brought the light that burst into the darkness. Father, those of us who have faith in you, we are now considered children of light, your light. And it's our light that also should shine in this dark world. Father, as we shine our light on things that are unrighteous, Lord, help us to do so with boldness, with courage, and yes, also with love. Father, I pray that this webinar will be beneficial for everyone who's tuning in. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, it gives me a great honor to introduce Pennsylvania Family Institute's president, Michael Geer, and he's going to introduce our panelists, and we're going to dive in to our discussion today. But again, if you do have questions during the webinar, make sure you're putting your questions in the Q&A area. Michael?
Well, Kurt, thank you very much, and Merry Christmas to all of the folks who are joining us from across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania on this snowy, rainy, icy day, wintry day for many of us here in Pennsylvania. It does kind of put us in the Christmas spirit to see the winter weather. So it's a blessing to have all of you with us, even though we're discussing a very weighty topic. Joining us on the panel is first of all retired Pennsylvania Superior Court Judge Cheryl Allen, who is of counsel here with us at Pennsylvania Family Institute and our Independence Law Center. And then our special guest joining us, the president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, John Stonestreet, and also the host of the regularly heard Breakpoint commentaries on radio stations. I was talking with a radio host up in New York State that has a network, the Family Life Network, throughout Pennsylvania and New York, talking about how powerful those Breakpoint seminars or commentaries are. And so, John, it's great to have you with us. And I want to start with a question because I remember the first time I heard this phrase, worldview. What is Christian worldview? What is a worldview, and what is a Christian worldview?
Well, listen, I'm grateful to be here, and I do, Michael, feel like I need to begin by saying you said that I was the special guest, but and you didn't say that about Judge Allen, but I feel like she's just as special as I am, and I just want to, and more special. So I just wanted to point that out.
Maybe it's just the prophet from out of town, I guess. Is what...
No, it isn't. Well, thanks so much for having us. And a worldview is something that is part of being human. We don't just see the world as objective viewers. We see the world through a lens of beliefs, a set of fundamental convictions. A lot of times we haven't even thought about these convictions. They're just things we've inherited from the culture around us, which is why when the culture changes, it's such a powerful force, particularly on the young. Because they don't know anything different. They don't know how drastically things can change. For example, that we are really the first civilization in history to ever play this experiment with marriage. There have been civilizations that have, for example, thought that a man can have many wives, but it's always involved a man and woman. It has never been so thoroughly disconnected from the fundamental reality of procreation, that men and women, when they have sex, have children, and society has a vested interest in the future of children. And to preserve children, moms and dads are the best situation by far. And those are just realities. And because of that, even societies throughout history that long that didn't have any influence from Christianity in terms of Christian morality whatsoever, and had no qualms with homoerotic behavior, never called that behavior or those relationships marriage, because it was just fundamentally observably different. Now, look, our kids now are being raised thinking that marriage is something completely different. They're assuming things about life in the world, assuming things about the human person. These assumptions are the thing, they become kind of our belief glasses. I've got contacts in. I don't look at my contacts except when I put them in and out. Almost all the time I'm looking through those contacts. And that's what a worldview is. It's our beliefs that we look through to see life in the world. But like my prescription, and Michael, you've got glasses on. If I take my contacts out and put your glasses on, suddenly your glasses aren't going to help me see the world. They're going to keep me from seeing the world. So the right or the wrong worldview makes all the difference in the world. And so it's important that we not just see all of these cultural issues as kind of the next issue to pop up and then like play cultural whack-a-mole and try to smack them all in the head. We need to think from a Christian worldview, understand the worldviews that are driving these particular issues to the front of our cultural lives, and then hopefully be able to make decisions based on truth.
So the particular subject of today's webinar is what is called the Respect for Marriage Act, I think wrongly named. We've been, and many have been calling it the Disrespect for Marriage Act. It was just signed into law. And it came kind of out of the blue, as it were. I mean, the Obergefell decision that came a number of years ago by the United States Supreme Court that imposed so-called same-sex marriage on the states kind of seemed to, in many people's minds, settle the issue, kind of the way they said Roe versus Wade settled the issue about abortion. And yet suddenly the Congress and the president are pushing this legislation. We at Pennsylvania Family Institute, many Christian ministries, many people of just good common sense have said, hey, wait a minute, this is not only unnecessary legislation, but it's troubling and damaging legislation. You've talked about the importance of marriage already in your first comments, but what what was it that caused you to sound the alarm at the Colson Center and you personally to talk about this particular piece of legislation?
Well, I think it's important to note that the Supreme Court doesn't settle anything. The Supreme Court can't settle hearts and minds. And that's why all of these issues at the end of the day are an issue of worldview. Justice Thomas, I think what initially birthed this was kind of almost a kind of a staging of a response to the Dobbs decision this summer, in which Justice Thomas, in a concurrent opinion, suggested that if we're going to go back and question Roe and question Casey versus Planned Parenthood on the abortion issue, well, you know what? There's other decisions that need to be, reevaluated, based on these invented categories of justice that the Supreme Court used in Roe v. Wade. And but there really wasn't an appetite. And so I think a group of, Democratic lawmakers said, well, we'll throw this out and it'll be good for the base. And suddenly we started to realize, oh, there's a group of Republicans, enough Republicans, more than we thought, that are willing then to not think as quote unquote conservatives that marriage is one of those things that needs to be conserved. That was kind of the real surprise. I started hearing rumors of that back in July. And then, of course, it actually ended up worse. I mean, more Republicans in the House supported it than many expected. And then, of course, they needed to get to that magic number of 10. And suddenly the numbers were adding up for people. And then, we also then in these latter days, as religious liberty protections, I think poor religious liberty protections were added to the bill. We had major evangelical institutions and publications demonstrate support for this. And that's a really troubling thing. Why? Well, I think there's at least three things here to consider. The first, and as important as it is, I think the least important of the three, is that the religious liberty protections were not robust. They did not, for example, protect religious institutions all the way through. It was a kind of compromise in the sense of admitting that, that this institution or this relational arrangement between two men and two women actually is marriage, but we want to be bigots in the corners of our own institutions and in our own churches and in our own homes. And that's not religious liberty. Religious liberty is not the ability to be a bigot. Religious liberty is actually the ability to make public arguments and to advocate publicly and to live public lives around it. No protections here for people not associated with religious institutions. No protections for the average parishioner who runs a cake shop or runs a flower or is somehow otherwise involved and being compelled to provide speech to support an institution they don't believe in. And that's a really troubling thing. We can't tolerate a gutted version of religious liberty and then think that somehow we can bolster it on the other side. That's not the way this works. The second reason that I think that was really troubling to me was I just saw how different the water was, the cultural waters are today than they were when the Obergefell decision came out. So, the narration was that this just really encoded Obergefell in law and did so at the legislative level. Well, beyond the fact that this isn't something that is up to the federal government, it should be up to the states, at the very least. The bigger problem here is that when Obergefell was decided, questions, for example, around gender identity and the existence of the T, transgender, in the acronym, were nowhere to be found. They weren't really part of the conversations. Today, the T's actually drive the train. They're actually deciding the narrative. And so this won't just be an opening of a door for marriage to include a homosexual relational arrangement, but it will be impossible to hold back other relational arrangements. Now, of course, I think Obergefell at some level made things like polygamy and incestuous marriage and things like that somewhere between possible and probable. This takes that further. And I think that was evidenced, Michael, in the celebration that the White House did for the signing of this bill just earlier this week, to invite as a featured guest a drag performer who makes a career out of sexualizing young children, and his performance dressed as a woman tells you where this is going, that this really isn't just about same-sex marriage. The president himself in his speech, which was just a reprehensible way of connecting people who have convictions about marriage being between a man and a woman, whether they're religious convictions or just convictions like the rest of humanity has always had until yesterday. To say that now, he basically said that makes you a racist, that makes you an anti-Semite, and he connected them all together. Now, that's a really important point, Michael, because if you remember in the Obergefell decision, Justice Kennedy, although wrongly, did say good people disagree on this. And good people should be able to disagree. Now, he predicted that they would be able to, and the debate would happen, and that hasn't happened, as we have seen with Jack Phillips and Barronelle Stutzman and so on. Yesterday, in signing this bill, President Biden said there are no good people who disagree with same-sex marriage. And that is a profound shift from the environment, culturally speaking, of 2015 when Obergefell was put into law into today. The third concern that I had is just a simple one. And here it is. Ready? Our government should tell the truth. And we should never want our government, whether it's from the bench, whether it is from the legislature, or whether it's from the White House, to say things that aren't true. And to say that marriage is something other than a man and a woman is just not true. And that means it's just not good law, no matter how many religious liberty protections are smuggled in, or how many assurances that we have that this won't affect you and all kinds of things. You want the government, you want the people in political power, just like you want your educators, just like you want your lawyers, just like you want your mechanics to tell you the truth. And the state here is not telling the truth.
You know, John, as you talk about this, I'm reminded, especially the second point that you were making there, I'm reminded of a couple of things from work that we've done here at Pennsylvania Family Institute. First, back when we were fighting to get a constitutional amendment to protect marriage in Pennsylvania, one of the speakers that we brought into the state several different times was Maggie Gallagher. We had her in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, and she sort of predicted where we were going with this. I remember her standing at a hotel before an audience in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, talking about the equation of they're saying this is the same as interracial marriage, the ban on interracial marriage, and they were saying that's what the ban on same-sex marriage is all about. And she said, if that's what they're talking about, then they're going to label you as bigots. They're going to create a situation where you won't be able to hold jobs, or you'll be prosecuted. All of these things that she walked down the pike with in terms of where she said we were going. And I remember being in debates and suggesting what Maggie had said, and people would say, oh, that's never going to happen, no way. And church people or others, and I think that same blinder is on for many people. Oh, good, they've given us some religious liberty protection, but we see where they're going, and that's the warning that you've been saying. The other one that I just wanted to mention, and this comes from the founder of the Colson Center, Chuck Colson. I remember he produced a video, I think it was back in 2010, that we used in many presentations when we were talking about the concerns related to sexual orientation and gender identity anti-discrimination laws. And he produced a video clip, a series, I guess they're called 2-minute warnings. Mm-hmm. And the specific one that we would play, and I almost have it memorized from having played it so many times. And he talked about what was coming on religious liberty concerns related to sexual orientation, gender identity, and also on the pro-life issue, saying, can you imagine a day when churches will be forced to do this or that, or a Christian ministry will be forced to do this because they don't believe in same-sex marriage or gay rights? Can you imagine a day when someone will be forced to perform an abortion that violates their religious conscience? And he said, I can imagine it.
Yeah.
It was always a forward-looking, he seemed to have a periscope or telescope into the future, prophetic.
He batted pretty much close to 1,000, and that's true. But also it's important to note that we don't have, this isn't going to force pastors to necessarily have a wedding in their church. But you know what? The people in their pews are forced. And one of the things we believe as Christians is that God calls all believers, and all believers are on mission and on vocation. So if a pastor shouldn't have to violate his conscience, a parishioner shouldn't have to violate his conscience or her conscience either. And that's really important. By the way, can I throw one more thing in there? Because I said 3 things, and there's a fourth that actually bothered me as well. If that's okay. I know I've rattled on and on and on. You want to hear from some other folks, but the other thing that's different about our environment is not only the T is now running the show, and not only that the ability to dissent is no longer acceptable like Justice Kennedy imagined it might be. But the right of marriage is very quickly becoming the right to children. And artificial reproductive technologies are actually delivering now sexless children and creating children where mothers are left out of the picture. Remember earlier this year when the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, and his partner laid in a hospital bed as if they had just given birth to their twins, as if the twins were theirs, and who was missing was the mom. And this is called the rights to parentage. And this is something that Colorado, my state, has advanced pretty aggressively in the last couple terms. And the right to marriage on this legislative level is going to have it's going to be a bucket, and there's going to be a whole lot of things poured into that bucket. And one of those things would be, for example, rights to children, and that includes insurance coverage for artificial reproductive technologies. We know that IVF has created a human rights crisis with excess embryos, and surrogates are actually can be taken advantage of, especially as poor women. And this whole thing gets filled up with all kinds of other things that go along with it. And that's another thing that I think is worth mentioning about the bill.
Yeah, I listened this morning on an NPR program where they were talking about reproductive rights, et cetera. It was a appalling program for me to listen to, because one of the things they were talking about was concern about the inability for people to discard embryos. They just said it basically that plainly. We can, some of the laws in certain states are preventing the opportunity for parents to discard embryos if they don't want them, which it was just spoken with. And that is coming, Katie Faust has written so wonderfully in her book, Them Before Us, about just what you're talking about. I want to first welcome those who have just joined into our webinar. This is the Pennsylvania Family Institute, a webinar on the Respect for Marriage Act, as its official name is. We would call it the Disrespect for Marriage Act, and the concerns related to Christian ministries, believers, those who simply hold to marriage between a man and a woman. And we're joined by John Stonestreet from the Colson Center, also Judge Cheryl Allen from our team here at Pennsylvania Family Institute. Judge, I want to talk to you because I know John has mentioned folks like Baron L. Stutzman, Jack Phillips, and others, and the notion, some are saying, well, this Disrespect for Marriage, Respect for Marriage Act has religious liberty protections, and people who find themselves in a difficult situation or being in some way lose a job or lose tax status can just go to court and defend their rights because the rights are there. You're a judge. You know what the judicial process is like. You know what the legal process is. What sort of assurance is there when you say, well, you can just go to court and defend your rights?
Well, anyone can go to court and defend their rights, but not everyone can afford an attorney. Not everyone has the time or the resources to bring a lawsuit. And I think the left knows that. And I hearken back to the words of Kristen Wagner from the Alliance Defending Freedom, where she stated that the process, the punishment is in the process. Because regardless of whether you prevail at the end, you've really put a plaintiff through literal hell and financial ruin. And that's the problem. And the fact that the Senate and the House, for that matter, refused to consider Senator Lee's amendment, which would have provided at least 501c3 protection, is very, very telling. And what they've basically done is they've left, the bill enables anti-discrimination lawsuits to be filed against religious individuals and or institutions, and it doesn't provide any affirmative protections for them. It could take weeks, months, even years without strong protection for religious institutions. And lawsuits are bound to follow. And my experience has been when you open the door a crack, you can't control what comes in. You really can't. And I would say and argue that while individual pastors may not be forced to yet provide or perform same-sex marriages, the law is very vague because it talks about anyone who's acting under color of state law. And that means if you or a child care agency, an adoption agency, or any Christian nonprofit or ministry, if you're involved with the government at all, you are vulnerable. If you are relying on the government, you have you have a daycare center and you need a license from the state to operate that daycare center, or you need accreditation for your private Christian school from the state, or you need that 501c3 status. Arguably, you are acting under color of state law if you don't comply with what the government says. And even pastors, I mean, when you stand up and perform a marriage ceremony and you say, by the power invested in me in the state, through the state of Pennsylvania, I now pronounce you husband and wife, you're invoking the state, and you sign that marriage license, which has to be filed with the state. And so, you know, it's just, the vagueness of it is what makes it so dangerous. The vagueness of it, the lack of specificity is what makes it so dangerous. And we know that there are groups who don't have the same live and let live mentality that some of these evangelical organizations who have supported this legislation may have. And they will actively seek out institutions to target, and they will target them for the express purpose of forcing an agenda on them. And so this is a very dangerous piece of legislation. It is not harmless, as they would have us believe. And also, you know, it talks about marriage between two individuals. I mean, what does that mean? Individuals, you know, are we talking about, what are we talking about?
Yes. Yeah.
There's so much room for interpretation there. So
Yeah.
it just provides an open door for litigation.
Absolutely does. So also joining us on this webinar is Kurt Weaver, who heads the Church Ambassador Network here at Pennsylvania Family Institute. I know, Kurt, you have been speaking with pastors, and there are many on this call, I believe, or on this webinar listening in. What concerns have you expressed to them, and what are you hearing back from them in terms of concern for their congregations, concern for ministries they might support, or for their own churches?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion about really what does this mean for society. You know, you talked a little bit about it, John, in regards to, you know, Obergefell, and then now this Respect for Marriage Act. What are the differences, and what does this mean for, you know, the faith community and churches? And we're talking about, you know, individual Christians and their religious liberty. And I think, John, your point earlier, yeah, this might not force pastors to have to now be required to perform same-sex marriages, right? However, now you have the issue of people sitting in the pews in your churches. You're going to have to guide them and direct them and help them to know, how do you live out your own closely held religious beliefs and morality, as we just read about in Ephesians 5, right? Take no part in immorality of the things of this world. And so what does that mean for the faith community? How should churches and pastors be talking about these things? I mean, there's two sides of it. One is, yeah, we want to be loving. We want to love all people. We want people to come through the doors of our of gospel-centered churches, those that are hurting, those who are confused with their gender, those who are living in immorality, and we want them to know the wonderful, life-changing message of Jesus Christ, Christ who died on the cross for our sins, right, and rose from the dead to give us new lives. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, wanting to know how to handle these things. How do Christian schools now operate within a world that now has this Respect for Marriage Act federally? So those are a lot of questions, and I'm hoping to hear a little bit more about how to handle some of those questions from Judge and John.
Yeah, John, any thoughts in terms of, you know, since you've been very outspoken on this, and you probably hear from those who disagree, but then you're also hearing from those, okay, well, what do you want us to do? So, you know, I run a Christian school or an adoption agency or something. What is the path forward in in a culture and where government is not telling the truth, where they're sort of thumbing their nose at God and basically saying, we don't care about what history or human civilization or the lessons of history and civilization, or for that matter, the creator of the world has tells us. We're going to do our own thing. What sort of response are you giving to folks about that?
You know, Michael, years ago, I was in a meeting with Chuck Colson. He called a group of leaders together. I was there in Virginia, and I'm not sure that I remember who said it, but one of the guys there said, you know, if we could just get all the Christians saved, we'd be in good shape. And that always, stuck with me because, you know, the point is, I do think this is a big challenge, but right now, particularly over what we saw in the midterms and the talk from Christian and Christian organizations, as the judge mentioned it, about this particular bill and the inability to think through what the implications are, and then to just have the display from the White House and the line from the president. None of that should have caught us by surprise. And yet at the same time, you know, we are in a place culturally where the first priority, if you ask me, for pastors, for Christian school teachers and administrators, is to commit to teach Christians about marriage and about sexuality and about God's design. We have got to get clear on this, and I don't think we are. What I mean by that is I think we've had about 10 or 15 years or 20 years of really wonderful marriage ministries and marriage teaching that had a lot to do with how to do marriage, you know, how to have a happy marriage and how to have a godly marriage. But we didn't spend enough time on catechizing the church on what marriage is and what God intended marriage to be for. And T.S. Eliot, in one of his articles on education, says this. He goes, you know, before we need to ask the question on how to do education, we need to ask the question, what is education for? And that begs the question, what is man for? What are humans for? So before we tell humans how to behave, we need to tell them what their purpose is. I think the same thing relates to marriage. And if you go to Matthew chapter 19, that's precisely what you see Jesus doing. Remember there that Jesus was asked by two teachers of the law about whether it was okay to do something with marriage, i.e. end it in divorce for any reason, as Moses, as they said, the law had taught. Now, there was a whole controversy in that time period about what the law actually said and didn't say. And, you know, the Sadducees there are just trying to loop Jesus into their religious conflict. But it's interesting what Jesus does. I mean, he's asked a specifically legal question about doing marriage or ending it. And he says, don't you know what was true from the beginning? And he points to male, female. He points to the oneness, the complete oneness of that only happens between a man and a woman. And he says, based on this, it's permanent. In other words, Jesus takes us back to the garden and what God created marriage for. And I just don't think I can overstate this. We have jumped to teaching the church about sexual morality without teaching them what sexuality is for. We've jumped to the moral teachings about marriage, and we have to do that, but we need to ground that in what marriage is for. I think right now, in a lot of people's minds, we're decorating a Christian morality on what is a secular worldview of marriage that they've embraced from their culture. Our culture has shifted dramatically because of the sexual revolution. There has not been a more successful social revolution in our lifetime, maybe in the last 2 to 3 centuries. The sexual revolution has upended the way we think about what it means to be human, top to bottom, in every aspect of our culture. So we got to go back. It reminds me of that Vince Lombardi story, you know, after the Green Bay Packers lost in the playoffs, and he holds up a football, you know, the first day of a practice with a bunch of NFL players and says, gentlemen, this is a football. So here we are, pastor, teacher, educator, mom, dad, grandparent. I really, really think we need to hold this up and go, gentlemen, this is a marriage. This is what marriage is for. This is what God intended. This is what Genesis 1, 2, and 3 tells us about it. These are all the analogies that Scripture uses, particularly Paul, to talk about what marriage is and what that tells us, so that we can have a right understanding of it. I guess I have had a new, I say appreciation, but I don't mean like in a good way. I have had a new revelation that the average person in the pew may not be where we think they are on abortion and on marriage. And that's just from the last 6 months.
Muted there. I was looking ahead of questions. I don't know, Kurt, if you have been looking at the questions that are coming in, anything in the chat box or questions that you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I would love to ask some questions here, either to John or the judge. There's one person writes in, as it relates to employment, my question is, how do we see this affecting religious exempt employers, as well as secular, privately held, Christian-owned businesses? What encouragement can we give these employers? John or Judge?
I think the judge has something to say here.
No, I just wanted to say that I think it's very clear from the language of the act that there is absolutely no protection for employees, even employees of Christian businesses. The act just leaves it wide open. But the other thing that I really wanted to say, because as I see it, even though they are saying that pastors or people will be exempt and not prohibited from exercising their sincerely held religious beliefs, again, it gets back to what is the degree of involvement, if any, with the government. And I think, and that's a very subjective question. We know that the left has been more successful in the courts across the board than they have been in legislatures. And that's why they go to the courts. But the other thing I wanted to stress is that I think that, and this goes to an earlier question that I think you had, Michael, I think that as a church, we're going to have to really evaluate the degree to which we want to be involved with the government. Since the founding of this country, there's always been this principle of separation of church and state. But what 501c3 has done is give the government the opportunity to reach its arms into the church and provide some regulation where previously there was none. And I think increasingly we are going to see that as long as a church is involved with the government, whether it's through the 501c3 tax laws, tax exempt laws or not, the less the church is going to be able to call illegal or consider something to be illegal, which the government has deemed to be legal. And that's just a fact. And that's an area I think the church is going to have to reevaluate, because there's nothing that says that a church has to be have 501c3 status in order to be a church. And I really feel very strongly, I think that's the way we're headed. And I think that if we're really going to be the church, we have to reevaluate that relationship.
If I could add to that, I think that's an absolutely terrific answer. I affirm all of that. And I think that the key is there is language in the Respect for Marriage Act that it mentions religious institutions and being protected, specifically religious educational institutions. The problem, as the judge said, is that it also has this nebulous, fuzzy language in there about being, somehow bringing the color of the state. And what does that even mean? And that's, of course, what happens in nebulous language. It becomes a road big enough for a Mack truck to be brought in. The other part of this too that I think we ought not forget is the Obama mandate, or the birth control mandate under Obamacare, and under the administration, the HHS mandate. Sorry, I was searching as I was talking. That's what I was looking for. The HHS mandate.
Right.
Do you remember what happened there with the HHS mandate, in which a group of nuns were forced by this to carry birth control pills?
Little sister.
Yeah, that's right. Not to mention Hobby Lobby, not to mention Liberty University.
Right.
Yeah.
Here in Pennsylvania, right?
No, that's right. See, what happened there was there was this religious exemption in the HHS mandate. And then the state turned around and defined religious institution so narrowly that a group of nuns didn't fit. So, this is what a group of nuns didn't qualify as a group of nuns that take vows of poverty and live off the support of Catholic charities and help old people die well did not count as a religious institution.
And
so what
no need for contraceptives, by the way.
Well, I mean, there's some things that are so crazy you can't make it up. That's the part of that that's like, we need to force these, people. But it's the other side of this that I'm trying to bring out on this, because there is religious liberty exemptions in this particular bill. Hugh Hewitt assured us that it was everything that we could hope for. So did a number of other evangelical institutions. What all of them I think are forgetting, with all due respect, is that once the government says you have a religious exemption, they then have the right to turn around. And this will happen also at the state level, and then determine who counts as a religious group and who doesn't count as a religious group. I remember having this conversation with Rick Warren, pastor of Saddleback Church. Saddleback Church would not have counted as a church under the HHS mandate because they serve people who didn't already agree with them. I mean, that was the way Kathleen Sebelius defined a religious institution. So those exemptions are not only poorly defined now, they're very vulnerable to being redefined tomorrow. And between the two of those things, that's why I agree with the judge. There's not sufficient protections here at the
and
least.
even with the 501c3 tax exemption, the test that's applied is whether the institution, whether upholding a particular law is in the best interest of society, or whether it contains whether there is a compelling public interest. And that is very subjective. And so the vagueness of the language is what's the most problematic, because it leaves it open for any court to determine that a particular policy of a religious institution does not serve the interest of society and is not in the interest of society. And, when you hear the president taking every group and talking about bigotry, and I'll tell you, there was absolutely no reason to link this issue of marriage, the same-sex marriage, with interracial marriage. No one has, interracial marriage is not under threat, but it bothers me because any movement they want to advance, they always want to link it up with Black civil rights or racial questions, as though that gives it more legitimacy. And it's very troubling, but that's the dishonesty of these people, and they will stop at nothing. And like I said before, the fact that they would not pass the Lee amendment that would have guaranteed protection under 501c3 is very telling. And as far as I'm concerned, as I read the act, the gate is wide open, and it leaves any religious institution, nonprofit, even the church, because many churches operate nonprofit corporations. And so it just leaves the church in a very vulnerable position, and that's the danger of it.
So, Judge or John, let me just throw in this question, because I think we're kind of leading up to something. Some individuals who supported this act claim that RFRA, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, would give the protections that these organizations needed, even though the Respect for Marriage Act was vague. What are your thoughts on that?
Go ahead, Judge.
No, you go ahead.
You're very kind. I think that for all the reasons that the judge has already brought out, it's not sufficient. And I'll add the cultural mood part, because I think a cultural mood has a lot to do with what the government thinks is a compelling interest and what it doesn't. Look, we're already 8 years. 2014 was when the attempt to pass a state level RFRA was seen as bigotry and intolerance. So if we think something that was passed 10 years before that is going to hold water right now, then we're just not seeing reality as it is. The other factor in this, to answer your question, is, and I want to let the judges comment on this wrong connection between same-sex marriage and interracial marriage. Stan, I mean, that was just a cynical rhetorical talking point, and it's unfair across the board, particularly to the long history of America and discrimination against African American slaves and all that. I mean, it's just, to do that is just highly, highly offensive. On the other hand, and I want to say this, yesterday or Tuesday or whenever it was that President Biden had that party, he also made a connection that's not in the bill. And it was not only a connection to that anybody who's against same-sex marriage is against is a racist and anti-Semite. That was horrific. He then connected any doctor who doesn't think that you should surgically operate in a permanent way to disfigure or castrate a child who has gender identity issues, and also a state that passes a law to protect these children. He put all of that together. Tell me what in the Respect for Marriage Act has anything to do right now with the very controversial, so controversial, in fact, that across Europe, countries are backpedaling, tripping all over themselves to stop doing mutilating surgeries on minors. Why would he mention that? He put transphobia into the conversation. By the way, when you add the word phobia to a whole bunch of things and then line them all up, that's an excuse for not making an argument. And he did not make an argument. Instead, he linked it all together. So not only did he link it with historical evils of the past, he yanked a whole nother category that has nothing to do with the Respect for Marriage Act, certainly was anywhere in the minds of even Justice Kennedy when he wrote the Obergefell decision back in 2015 and lined them all up and said, anybody who is against, and he said, they're all connected, and anyone who's not on our side is doing it because of hate. Justice Kennedy told us that some people don't agree with this, and it's not because of animus. President Biden told us Monday that anyone who doesn't agree, it is because of animus and it is because of hate. So that's driving this.
And that provides us with a clear picture of where this is heading.
Right.
So
no, I was going to say that very same thing. You know, when I talked about Chuck Colson and his 2-minute warning, looking ahead, they're telling us what they want to do. So I just wonder, John, as you look at the evangelical groups that were backing this Respect for Marriage Act, so-called, and whatever, are they standing there looking at that ceremony, so-called ceremony, that party, and where they lit up the White House in rainbow colors, and the president is talking about transgender, so-called transgender sex reassignment surgery and things? Do they realize that that's the door they've opened up? They should realize it, and I'm sure you've warned some of them that's very much what they're opening up. Why are they so seemingly trusting, do you think?
Well, you know, look, I don't want to impinge motives, and I think sometimes, especially Christians, have a what could be confused as a positive motive to not be a stumbling block, not create unnecessary, challenges for the gospel. I just think it is always the wrong bargain to pick God's morality against God's gospel, that somehow how God created the world is going to stand in the way of him saving people. And that's the mistake that people make on this. They also think that this isn't a salvation issue. It's a creation issue. Jesus himself said it was a creation issue. They also think, well, it has nothing to do with me. Sinners are going to sin. Well, yeah, but every generation of Christians, when they have found themselves in conflict with the larger culture, it almost always has taken the form of needing to protect children. We now have to protect children. So to say this isn't a gospel issue is just wrong. And honestly, I think what motivated, and I'll tell you what they told me, what some of these folks told me, is that it's better to get some religious protections than none. And that's the most thoughtful answer that I heard. And as you can already tell from the judge and myself, I doubt we think that that's a very thoughtful approach, and it's ignoring the larger thing. And then I think what's motivated a lot more, and I'm not going to call out any names at this point, but I think what motivated a lot more is that there's a real sense that this has been a lot of bad press for Christians, and they want this thing to go away. It's kind of like how many people have talked and thought about the abortion issue. It is really stunning to me how many churches, and I'm just looking at the ones around my own town, that during the Black Lives Matter protest of 2020, during some of the immigration questions, were just completely willing to stand up and say very clear things about that. I didn't always agree with what they said, but they said very clear things. But they are just not willing to touch these things. It's almost as if there's a temptation to only talk about culturally divisive issues if the culture has already decided on what the right answer is. And if our answer is not in line with that, then we're being divisive. And I think it's a real theological anemia in the church. I think it's sourced in both a lack of a public theology that's robust enough for the challenges that we face, and a lack of a creational theology. So a doctrine of creation and a doctrine of public life, I think is largely missing in the way we talk about truth, and we talk about Christianity. We talk about what it means to be saved, and we talk about what it means to follow Jesus. Those two things are in short supply, but it's historically always been part of the church's witness, both of those things.
Yeah.
So John, recently, we saw the Mormon Church coming out in support of the Disrespect for Marriage Act, and growing up, you would see lots of commercials and magazines on the family, and they were very out-focused on wanting to see the family unit strengthened. And then you have them now in support of this act. What do you think happened there? What do you think some of the reasoning is for the Mormon Church to step in on this?
Well, I don't want to speak for individual Mormons because I don't know the answer to that. But the thing is, with the Mormon Church, it's a very hierarchical situation, and the decision is made from the top on these things. And I think that there's two things at work here. Number one, and I think this is the most common one, the history of Mormonism is one in which there was a very uncomfortable relationship between the church and the powers that be. And the desire now since then, if you go back to the history of Mormonism in America and the conflict that happened state after state after state after state as the church moved west, and finally was able to carve out almost an entire state where they had that sort of protection. There's a history there. Not unlike our other, you could look at other religious groups. There's a history there that determines, whether they want to be on the wrong side of the state or not on the wrong side of the state. And I think that is the number one thing kind of shaping this, that the handwriting's on the wall and we need to carve out a space for us to be us. I think that's probably the motivation. With some of the more radical groups, I don't know if, the Mormon Church officially, the official Mormon Church certainly has rejected alternative relational arrangements such as polygamy. But that's part of the history as well. And I'm sure for some groups that, the idea of redefining marriage further might be part of it. I doubt that's the LDS situation. I wouldn't say that it is, but I do think that you have to understand the history of the conflict between the Mormon Church and the larger society. But that's a disappointing thing, right? Because then at some point there's this idea that, well, we're Christians, let us believe what we want in the corner of our own life. That has never been what it means to be a follower of Jesus. To believe the right thing is essential to what it means to be Christian. To live out of that is also essential to what it means to be a Christian. We're not believers and not doers, or doers and not believers. We're both all the time, and you can't separate the two. And
it just seems that as I look at, especially what I witnessed during the midterm elections, the church seems to be heavily relying upon pragmatism, what is practical, and we're going to be the church of public opinion. When you put pragmatism in the equation, But at the end of the day, if we're going to be the church, we're going to have to stand on the word of God and, take that stand and everything that comes with it. But the word of God, people ask all the time, well, what is your opinion about this issue or your opinion about that issue? And, my opinion is irrelevant. It's what does God say about the issue? And that's what my thought is. That's what I'm going to stand on. And, the church has moved away from that to some extent into pragmatism, into cooperating, in the name of tolerance, which really means compromise to me. And it's just unfortunate.
So I'm going to end with two questions here. I want to hear from both of you, Judge and John. This one question comes up. Now that same-sex marriage bill has already passed federally, what can we do on the state level to reach out to work out or to reach out our disagreements on what the federal government has already passed and signed? Is there anything that can be done on the state level?
I think the short answer is yes, and the long answer is yes. And what I mean by the long answer is that it's time we have to learn from the pro-life movement and what it means to do a couple things. Number one, that the most important action now is local, and it's going to be local at the city level. It's going to be local at the state level. I mean, we've already mentioned Jack Phillips, and Judge Allen mentioned the arguments from Christian Wagoner. That was in a 303 creative case. Both of those come out of my state of Colorado. The state of Colorado is empowering a civil rights commission that is unhinged and allowing private citizens to go after other citizens in the case of Scardenia law firm and Jack Phillips. So there are things that can be done both by individual Christians on the local level to populate these commissions, to attend these commission meetings, to show up, to ask questions. We've seen the power of folks at school boards, right, all across America. We just saw an incredible situation in the state of Virginia this past week, where had there not been, I think, a whole lot of accountability brought to the Loudoun County School Board, that there would not be, a number of things. Number one, there wouldn't be the incredible growth in Christian schools across America because the Loudoun County School Board is kind of the salesman of the year for private education. But there's also the superintendent was arrested this week, was charged with a cover-up of a crime. And I don't know that we would get there without all of that sort of groundwork that was laid with that public, everyday engagement. We got to play the long game in that, if that makes sense. So and I'll also say this, the pro-life movement, and there's plenty of work left to do there. So this is not a model in terms of look what they accomplished, it's look what they've done. But they also got increasingly more creative. And I think there are creative local legislative options that we haven't even thought of yet. And that needs to happen. And of course, we've got to do the hard job of persuading hearts and minds, especially the younger generation. So the most important thing we can do at the end of the day is pastors, catechize your church members, parents, catechize your kids, educators, catechize your students about what marriage is. We're going to have to rebuild those foundations.
I also, and I was reading an article the other day, and now it slips my mind, but I think that it was Attorney Matt Sarver or Staver. I'm not sure. He's from the Liberty
Council, right?
Liberty Council, and he was talking about the fact that in many respects, he believed that the passage of this law will open the door to further litigation, and this issue will come before the Supreme Court again. And with Roe v. Wade, for example, we have to remember it may have taken 49 years, but some legislators in Mississippi were courageous enough to pass legislation, which eventually led to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. There are cases, I understand, in the pipeline today that will hopefully find their way to the Supreme Court, so that they will have an opportunity to address this issue. And the fact is that we all know that Obergefell, when that opinion was written, that was a dramatically different Supreme Court than the one we have today. And so I think that when these cases arrive, that we as a church have to support these litigants. And I can't stress enough the importance of really educating our people, because you're right, most people don't have a clue of what the Respect for Marriage Act is. They don't have a clue about the legislation that is being put forth through the federal government, and even in some instances like California state governments, which are purposed to radically change our value system, the way we live, the way we think, and basically to radicalize and sexualize our children. So, we can't just sit passively by. I'm hoping that this legislation, people will recognize the seriousness of it and that it will spur believers into action.
Amen, Judge. Well, our time has flown by, hasn't it? And here we are at the end of our webinar. And thank you all for tuning in today. Hopefully this was a great conversation. We could probably talk about this all afternoon. This topic is wide and deep, and it has its tentacles almost in every area of society. And so I think we'll be probably having many more conversations like this in the months and years ahead. But I do want to wish everyone a Merry Christmas, and remember, it was Christ who came into this world, God made flesh, right? Who came into this world and brought the light into this dark world. And it's that light that we carry with us each and every day. And I would say this to all the pastors and church leaders that are on here. And John, you said this a few years ago, and I picked up on it and used it quite often. And that is, please, please, please disciple your people on how to think biblically about social issues, how to think biblically about gender, how to think biblically about marriage. Why does marriage exist? Why does gender exist? Talk about the Imago Dei. Talk about it in a positive way, not just a negative way that we're against this, but why are we for biblical marriage? Why is this in God's economy the best way? Why is sexuality done in the confines of God's economy helpful and healthy for us and society? And so be thinking about those things. We'll be sending out the recording of this and also some other helpful resources to you all. Again, thank you for joining, and we hope you all have a wonderful Merry Christmas. Have a great day.